Move away from the shelf, Richard Coleman said, his voice echoing across the marble reading hall. You are a librarian, not a lawyer. Laughter burst from the board members, sharp enough to bounce off the towering oak bookcases. Naomi Brooks did not answer. Her dark eyes stayed on a weathered volume resting behind locked glass. Late afternoon sunlight spilled through the stained windows, stretching across the polished floor like strips of gold, while the old air vents hummed softly above the silence that followed. Richard straightened his tailored jacket and stepped toward the center table where cameras from the local news station waited. Today, he announced with a confident smile, this outdated building begins its final chapter. Next month, this place becomes the Coleman Commerce Center. Applause filled the room. Naomi lowered her gaze for only a moment. Her fingers tightened around the brass key hanging beneath her employee badge. She had carried that key every morning for 23 years. Most people thought it opened forgotten cabinets. Very few knew what it truly protected. Emily Carter, another board member, folded her arms with a smirk. She still thinks books matter more than progress. Several people chuckled again. One young intern avoided looking at Naomi altogether, pretending to organize paperwork while the clicking of camera shutters grew louder. Dust floated lazily through warm shafts of light, disturbed only by the slow-turning ceiling fans that had watched generations come and go. Richard walked closer until only a few feet separated them. Do not embarrass yourself, he said quietly enough that only Naomi could hear. History belongs in museums. Money builds the future. Naomi finally looked up. Her expression remained calm, almost impossibly calm, but something behind her eyes refused to move. She glanced past Richard toward the oldest section of the library where leather-bound volumes rested in perfect rows. Every shelf seemed to breathe beneath decades of silence. Somewhere in the distance, an antique clock ticked once. Then twice. The sound settled over the room like a warning nobody understood. Olivia Hayes, a local reporter, noticed Naomi watching the shelves instead of the board. She lowered her microphone slightly. Something about the librarian did not look defeated. She looked patient. Richard raised a polished silver pen above the redevelopment contract. Any final objections? He asked with theatrical confidence. Speak now, or this building belongs to the future. Another ripple of laughter rolled through the audience. Naomi took one measured step toward the glass cabinet. A security guard immediately shifted into her path. Ma'am, he said politely, please stay behind the line. She stopped without protest. Her heartbeat echoed faintly in her ears, but her breathing never changed. I only need one book, she said. Richard laughed louder than before. One book? He turned toward the room. Ladies and gentlemen, apparently one old book is going to stop a $50 million project. Even the contractors smiled. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone tapped impatient fingers against the conference table. Naomi slowly lifted the small brass key from around her neck. Its metal caught the sunlight, flashing for only a second. An elderly man seated quietly in the back row suddenly leaned forward, his face draining of color the instant he saw the key. His trembling hand gripped the armrest. No, he whispered under his breath, too softly for anyone except Olivia to notice. Naomi slid the key into the cabinet lock. The ancient mechanism answered with a heavy metallic click that echoed through the hall. Every conversation stopped. Richard's confident smile faded just enough to reveal uncertainty. As the glass door opened and Naomi reached for a single worn leather book wrapped in faded blue cloth, the elderly man rose to his feet and said, She cannot open that book unless she knows what is hidden inside. The brass key stopped turning, and the entire library seemed to hold its breath. Naomi rested her hand on the worn leather cover for one quiet second before lifting the book with both hands. Dust shimmered through the late afternoon light, floating between the stained glass windows like tiny sparks frozen in the air. Nobody laughed now. Richard Coleman folded his arms, forcing a smile that looked thinner than before. It is just another old book, he said. Open it if you want. It changes nothing. His voice echoed across the marble floor, but the confidence behind it had begun to crack. Naomi slowly carried the volume to the long oak conference table. Every step of her sensible shoes clicked against the polished stone, measured, calm, impossible to rush. Olivia Hayes instinctively raised her camera. Something told her this was no ordinary archive. The elderly man from the back row moved closer, his breathing uneven. "That book has not been opened in decades," he whispered. Emily glanced at him with confusion. "What are you talking about?" He never answered. Naomi carefully untied the faded blue cloth wrapped around the cover. The old leather creaked softly. The smell of aged paper and cedar drifted into the room, carrying the unmistakable scent of history preserved in silence. Richard tapped his silver pen against the table, faster now. Tap. 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 "Enough theater," he said. "Read your fairy tale." Naomi opened the first page. Inside was not gold, nor treasure, nor secret maps. Only neat handwritten names, dates, and careful signatures stretching back more than 100 years. Contractors exchanged puzzled looks. A lawyer leaned forward. "That looks like a registry." Naomi turned another page without speaking. Her fingers never trembled. The ancient paper whispered beneath her touch. The room grew so quiet that everyone could hear the distant hum of the heating system above them. Then a folded envelope slipped free and landed gently on the polished table. Richard frowned. "What is that?" Nobody moved. Even the security guards stared at the envelope instead of Naomi. The elderly man closed his eyes for a brief moment. "I prayed nobody would ever need to see that," he murmured. Olivia carefully zoomed her camera toward the faded wax seal. It had never been broken. Richard laughed once, but it sounded forced. "Open it. Let us finish this." Naomi looked directly at him for the first time since entering the meeting. "Are you certain?" she asked quietly. The question lingered in the air far longer than anyone expected. Richard straightened his shoulders. "Completely." Naomi nodded once. She slipped one finger beneath the brittle seal and carefully unfolded the century-old letter. The paper crackled through the silent hall. Several attorneys unconsciously stepped closer. Naomi scanned the opening lines, and for the first time her calm expression shifted. Not toward fear. Toward surprise. She had expected one document. Instead, there were two. A second page, hidden behind the first, slid into view. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The elderly man stared at the page and whispered, "That was never supposed to be there." Richard noticed Naomi hesitate. His smile returned. "What is wrong?" he asked. "Did your miracle disappear?" Naomi slowly lifted her eyes from the letter. The color had drained from Richard's face before she had spoken a single word, because the name written across the second page was not the founder of the library. It was Richard Coleman's own grandfather. The silence shattered before anyone found the courage to breathe. Richard Coleman stared at the second page as if the ink itself had betrayed him. The confident smile he had worn all afternoon disappeared behind a tightening jaw. Around the oak table, phones slowly lifted into the air. Tiny camera lenses reflected the amber light pouring through the stained glass, capturing every flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Naomi did not look at the crowd. She kept her eyes on the letter, her fingertips resting gently against the brittle paper, as though she feared history might crumble beneath too much force. "Read it," Richard said, his voice lower than before. "Go ahead." It sounded less like a command and more like a challenge he suddenly regretted making. Naomi glanced toward the elderly man. He gave the slightest nod. That was enough. She began reading aloud. "To my son, Samuel Coleman." The room froze. Richard blinked. Samuel was his grandfather's name. Naomi continued, her calm voice filling every corner of the library. "If you are reading this, then the future of this library has once again been placed above the value of its people." Several attorneys exchanged uneasy looks. Emily quietly lowered her tablet. The heating vents hummed overhead, while an old wall clock ticked with relentless precision. Naomi turned the page slowly. "Remember this above all else. Our family fortune was built because this community believed knowledge belonged to everyone. Never allow our name to profit from destroying the very place that gave us our beginning." Richard stepped forward. "Enough." His polished shoes scraped sharply across the marble floor. Naomi stopped reading, but she did not close the letter. The pause only made the silence heavier. Olivia noticed a bead of sweat sliding down Richard's wrist before disappearing beneath the cuff of his expensive watch. She had interviewed him dozens of times. She had never seen him lose control. "That proves nothing," Richard said. "It is an old family opinion. Nothing more." One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "Sir, there is another paragraph." Richard's eyes snapped toward him. "Do not tell me what is in my family's documents." Naomi quietly turned the page. Another folded sheet slipped loose, thicker than the others, stamped with an embossed city seal that had faded but remained unmistakable. Even the security guard leaned forward. The elderly man whispered, "I never knew it survived." Naomi unfolded the document with extraordinary care. The parchment crackled through the silent hall. The scent of cedar and old paper drifted across the conference table. She scanned only a few lines before her breathing slowed. She understood exactly what she was holding. Richard noticed the change in her expression. "What is it?" he demanded. Naomi looked up, meeting his eyes without anger, without triumph, only quiet certainty. "This is not a letter," she said. "It is an amendment." A murmur rippled through the room. Every attorney moved closer. Olivia instinctively pressed the record button again. Naomi continued. "It appears your grandfather rewrote the original property agreement." Richard laughed once, but nobody joined him. "Impossible." Naomi gently rotated the parchment toward the attorneys instead of toward Richard. "Then perhaps one of them should read it." The oldest attorney adjusted his glasses with trembling hands and leaned over the table. His eyes moved across the first paragraph. Then the second. The color drained from his face. He removed his glasses completely, blinking as though he hoped the words would disappear. Finally he looked directly at Richard and whispered, barely loud enough for the room to hear, "Sir, if this document is authentic, you have not been trying to buy this library." He swallowed hard. "You have been trying to sell something your family no longer legally owns." Richard Coleman slammed both palms onto the polished oak table. The sharp crack echoed through the library, startling even the reporters. "That document is a forgery," he snapped. "Nobody touches another page." His voice carried authority, but it could not hide the strain tightening every word. The attorneys remained frozen, their eyes fixed on the parchment instead of their client. Naomi Brooks never flinched. The cool glow from the brass reading lamps reflected across the century-old seal, while the quiet hum of the climate system seemed suddenly deafening. Somewhere behind the crowd, another phone camera switched on. Then another. Tiny red recording lights appeared one after another like silent witnesses. Richard noticed them immediately. His breathing shortened. "Turn those cameras off," he ordered. Nobody moved. Olivia Hayes lowered her microphone just enough to hear the whispers spreading through the room. "If that amendment is real, this could invalidate everything. Did he know?" Richard caught fragments of every sentence. His expensive suit suddenly felt too warm beneath the library lights. A thin line of sweat formed along his collar despite the cool air. Emily Carter stepped closer to Naomi, still unwilling to surrender her skepticism. "How did you even know where to look?" she asked. Naomi rested one hand gently on the open volume. "Because everyone kept reading the building." She looked toward the towering shelves stretching into the shadows. "I spent 23 years reading the people who built it." The answer puzzled nearly everyone except the elderly man. His eyes filled with quiet recognition. "She remembers," he whispered. Richard turned sharply toward him. "What does that mean?" The old man slowly removed a faded photograph from his jacket pocket. The edges were curled with age. He placed it beside the amendment. The room leaned forward almost as one. In the black and white image stood the library's dedication ceremony from nearly a century earlier. Children smiled on the front steps. Volunteers held books against their chests. Near the center stood Samuel Coleman beside the founder. And standing only a few feet away was another man whose face looked strikingly familiar. Olivia narrowed her eyes. Then realization swept across her expression. She looked from the photograph to Naomi. "That is your grandfather." Naomi nodded once. "He was the library archivist." Silence returned. Richard stared at the picture as though it had appeared from nowhere. "Impossible." Naomi spoke softly. "Every document my grandfather preserved was indexed twice. Once in the public catalog." Her finger moved toward the amendment. "And once inside this family ledger." One attorney suddenly stood upright. "Wait." He hurried toward a nearby archive cabinet. Metal drawer handles clinked as he pulled open a massive index file. Cards slid rapidly beneath his fingertips. The only sounds were paper brushing paper and the nervous tapping of Richard's polished shoe against the marble floor. Finally the attorney stopped. His hand froze. He slowly removed a yellowed catalog card. His face lost every trace of confidence. "It is here," he whispered. "The amendment has been indexed since 1934. Gasps spread across the room. Richard lunged forward just enough to glimpse the card before stopping himself. His jaw tightened. The reporters no longer whispered. Their cameras clicked relentlessly, each shutter sounding louder than the last. Naomi carefully closed the old ledger, protecting its fragile pages with both hands. She looked directly at Richard. "You believed history had forgotten this place." Richard said nothing. For the first time all afternoon, he had no answer. Then the attorney unfolded the final page attached behind the catalog record. His eyes widened in disbelief before he slowly lifted his head toward Richard. "Sir," he said, barely able to speak, "there is one more signature on this amendment, and according to this record, it belongs to someone who is still alive." The attorney's words hung in the air like a crack spreading across glass. "The final signature belongs to someone who is still alive." Every phone in the room remained pointed toward Richard Coleman. Tiny recording lights blinked through the warm afternoon shadows while the old ventilation system hummed overhead with relentless steadiness. Richard's face hardened. "Who?" he demanded. The attorney swallowed before answering. "Margaret Whitmore." A wave of whispers rolled through the library. Emily stared in disbelief. "The former city historian?" The attorney nodded. "She was also the last legal trustee named in this amendment." Richard shook his head immediately. "Impossible. She disappeared years ago." Naomi's eyes never left the document. "No," she said quietly. She retired. The room fell silent again. Richard turned toward her, anger replacing disbelief. "Do not pretend you know her." Naomi met his gaze without raising her voice. "I visited her every Thursday for almost 8 years after she left the library." That answer landed harder than anyone expected. Olivia slowly lowered her camera, stunned. Even the security guard looked at Naomi differently now. Richard let out a short, bitter laugh. "Convenient." He stepped closer until only the conference table separated them. "You expect everyone here to believe an old librarian has secretly been meeting the one person who could destroy my project?" Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she opened the ledger one more time and carefully removed a small envelope tucked inside the back cover. The paper was newer than everything else, but its edges had begun to yellow with time. A date was written neatly across the front. 6 years earlier. Richard's confidence flickered. "What is that?" Naomi rested the envelope on the polished wood. "She told me never to open it unless someone tried to erase this library." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Nobody moved. The investors standing near the windows exchanged uneasy glances. One quietly loosened his tie. Another lowered the redevelopment blueprint he had been holding all afternoon. Richard's breathing became shallow. "That envelope proves nothing." Naomi looked toward the attorney. "Would you like to open it?" Before he could answer, Richard reached across the table. "No." His voice came out louder than he intended. Every eye turned toward him. He slowly withdrew his hand, suddenly aware that dozens of cameras had captured the moment. Olivia noticed it immediately. So did everyone else. Why would a man so certain of his case be afraid of one sealed envelope? The attorney carefully broke the flap. The brittle paper crackled through the silent hall. He unfolded a single handwritten letter and read the first line. His eyebrows lifted. Then his expression changed completely. This? He stopped speaking. Richard took another step forward. Read it. The attorney hesitated. His hand visibly trembled. It says that if anyone from the Coleman family ever attempts to sell the property for private commercial development. He looked up slowly, unable to hide the shock in his eyes. The trustees are instructed to deliver additional evidence directly to the State Historical Commission. A stunned murmur swept across the room. Richard's face strained of color. Additional evidence? Emily whispered. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief moment, as though remembering a promise made years ago. When she opened them again, they were fixed on the library's tallest bookshelf. Margaret told me there was one final archive, she said softly. She never trusted anyone to keep it except herself. Richard followed Naomi's gaze toward the towering shelves. For the first time that afternoon, fear replaced anger. Then, from the front entrance, the heavy bronze doors slowly swung open. Every head turned as an elderly woman with silver hair stepped inside, carrying a weathered leather case in both hands. The bronze doors eased shut behind Margaret Whitmore with a deep metallic thud that lingered through the library long after the sound had faded. Nobody spoke. Even the dozens of phone cameras remained perfectly still, their tiny recording lights glowing like silent stars beneath the warm chandeliers. Margaret walked slowly across the marble floor, the weathered leather case resting carefully against her side. Every measured step echoed through the vast reading hall. Naomi Brooks did not move. She simply watched the elderly woman approach with the quiet composure of someone who had spent years waiting for this exact moment. Richard Coleman swallowed hard. The confidence that had filled his voice only minutes earlier had vanished completely. His fingers tightened around the edge of the conference table until his knuckles turned pale beneath the polished brass lamps. Margaret, he said, forcing a smile that reached nowhere near his eyes. This has become a misunderstanding. Margaret stopped several feet away. She studied Richard for a long moment before looking at Naomi. A faint, almost invisible smile crossed her face. You kept your promise, she said softly. Naomi lowered her head. I told you I would not open the final archive unless someone tried to erase this place. The room absorbed those words in complete silence. Olivia Hayes slowly lowered her microphone. For the first time all afternoon, she no longer saw Naomi as the quiet librarian everyone had dismissed. She saw someone trusted with a responsibility that had outlived generations. The realization spread across the room without anyone saying it aloud. Emily Carter glanced toward the towering shelves surrounding them. They no longer felt like ordinary bookcases. They felt like witnesses. Richard stepped forward, trying to reclaim control. If there is evidence, then let everyone see it. His voice sounded steadier, but a faint tremor remained beneath every syllable. Margaret rested the leather case on the conference table. The old brass clasps reflected the cool white light overhead. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she placed one weathered hand gently across the lid and closed her eyes for a brief moment. The heating system hummed softly above them. Somewhere near the entrance, a cell phone vibrated against a wooden chair before falling silent again. Nobody even turned to look. Every breath in the room seemed synchronized. Margaret opened her eyes and looked directly at Richard. Your grandfather came to me 50 years ago. Richard froze. He cried. The sentence landed with astonishing weight. Several investors exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody had ever associated the Coleman name with vulnerability. Margaret continued quietly. He said one day someone in his own family might forget why this library existed. Richard lowered his gaze. His jaw tightened, but he offered no reply. Naomi watched him carefully. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only sadness. She understood something the others were only beginning to see. This was no longer about property. It was about inheritance, memory, and a promise slowly collapsing beneath ambition. Margaret gently released the clasps. The soft metallic clicks echoed through the silent hall. She lifted the lid only a few inches before stopping. Inside rested several neatly wrapped bundles of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. On top lay a single envelope bearing Richard's full name written in elegant handwriting. Olivia's heartbeat quickened. Even from across the table she could recognize the signature beneath it. Samuel Coleman. Richard stared at the envelope without blinking. His breathing slowed until the entire room seemed to breathe with him. Margaret carefully lifted the letter but did not hand it over. Instead, she looked back at Naomi. There is one thing they still do not know. Naomi's calm expression changed for the first time that afternoon. Her eyes widened ever so slightly, as though even she had not expected those words. Then Margaret turned the envelope over, revealing a line written across the back in fading ink. Richard read it once. The color drained completely from his face. He whispered, almost too quietly for anyone to hear, "My grandfather knew, before I was even born." Richard Coleman's whisper seemed to drain every sound from the library. "My grandfather knew, before I was even born." Nobody moved. The brass reading lamps cast pale reflections across stunned faces while dozens of phone cameras continued recording in absolute silence. Margaret Whitmore slowly extended the envelope toward Richard, but he never reached for it. His hand hovered in the air, trembling just enough for everyone to notice. Naomi Brooks remained still beside the ancient ledger, her hands folded calmly before her. She looked neither victorious nor angry. She looked like someone carrying a truth that had become too heavy to hold alone. "Read it," Margaret said quietly. Richard swallowed. "You read it." Margaret nodded once and unfolded the letter with extraordinary care. The brittle paper crackled softly, sounding louder than the distant hum of the ventilation system. Every investor leaned forward. Even Emily Carter forgot the notebook still resting in her hands. Margaret began. "To my grandson Richard. If this letter reaches you, then I have failed to teach my own family the purpose of our name." Richard closed his eyes. The words struck harder than any accusation. Margaret continued. "The library was never our greatest possession. It was our greatest debt. We were trusted to protect it, never to own it." A wave of uneasy whispers swept across the room. Olivia Hayes glanced toward the investors. Several had quietly lowered the redevelopment contracts onto the table. Nobody seemed interested in signing anything anymore. Richard forced himself to look at Naomi. For the first time that afternoon, there was no trace of superiority in his eyes. Only confusion. "Why did you never tell anyone?" he asked. Naomi answered after a long pause. "Because the library was never mine to defend with my voice." She gently rested her fingertips on the old ledger. "It had to defend itself with the truth." The sentence settled over the room with astonishing weight. Nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. The silence itself became an answer. Margaret turned to the final page of the letter. Her expression softened. "Samuel wrote one final request." Richard slowly opened his eyes again. Margaret read aloud. "If my grandson ever forgets that knowledge belongs to every child, every worker, every dreamer, then place this letter in the hands of the librarian. Trust her judgment above our family's ambition." The room froze. Richard stared at Naomi in disbelief. Emily's lips parted, but no words came. The attorneys exchanged stunned glances before quietly stepping away from Richard and toward Naomi, almost instinctively acknowledging where the moral authority now stood. Olivia noticed the subtle shift immediately. Just hours earlier, everyone had watched Naomi from a distance. Now they were waiting for her to speak. Richard lowered his head. The polished confidence that had defined him all afternoon dissolved beneath the weight of his grandfather's words. "I thought," he began before stopping. His voice cracked slightly. "I thought I was honoring my family's legacy." Naomi stepped closer, her footsteps barely audible against the marble floor. She stopped on the opposite side of the table, close enough that only the old ledger separated them. "You were protecting the buildings your family built," she said gently. "Your grandfather asked you to protect the people they were built for." Richard could not answer. Behind him, one investor quietly folded the redevelopment blueprint in half. Another slipped the unsigned contract back into a briefcase. The momentum of the entire project seemed to collapse without a single argument. Then the oldest attorney cleared his throat. His face had grown unusually pale. "There is one remaining problem." Every eye turned toward him. He looked from Margaret to Naomi before speaking. "Samuel's letter changes everything." He hesitated. "But the State Historical Commission received a sealed filing from Margaret 6 years ago." Margaret lowered her eyes. Naomi's calm expression finally shifted. "You filed it already?" she asked softly. Margaret nodded. "I had to." The attorney drew a slow breath. "If that filing has already been processed," he looked directly at Richard, "then this library may no longer belong to the Coleman family, the city, or any of us." The attorney's final sentence settled over the library like winter air. No one reached for a phone. No one whispered. Even the faint hum of the climate system seemed to disappear beneath the weight of what had just been revealed. Richard Coleman remained frozen, his eyes fixed on the old documents spread across the oak table. The polished confidence that had once filled the room had dissolved into something far quieter and far heavier. Naomi Brooks did not celebrate. She gently closed the century-old ledger and rested both hands upon its worn leather cover, as though thanking an old friend rather than claiming a victory. Margaret Whitmore looked toward the rows of towering bookshelves, her silver hair glowing beneath the warm reading lamps. "History never belongs to one family," she said softly. "It belongs to every person willing to protect it." The words echoed through the silent hall. Olivia Hayes slowly lowered her camera. She realized she was no longer documenting a business dispute. She was witnessing the moment an entire community reclaimed its memory. Around the conference table, the investors quietly exchanged uneasy glances. One after another, redevelopment folders closed with soft thumps against polished wood. No speeches. No arguments. Just quiet acceptance. Emily Carter walked toward Naomi, her footsteps slow against the marble floor. Earlier that afternoon she had laughed with everyone else. Now she could barely meet Naomi's eyes. "I judged you," she admitted, her voice almost breaking. "I thought you were protecting old books because you were afraid of change." Naomi answered with the same calm dignity she had carried all day. "Books were never the point." Emily looked down. Naomi continued gently. "People forget buildings. They rarely forget the place that taught them who they could become." Emily nodded without speaking. Her eyes glistened beneath the library lights. Nearby, several board members quietly removed their nameplates from the conference table, no longer certain they deserved the authority they had carried into the room only hours before. Richard finally stepped away from the contracts. Every movement seemed heavier than the last. His expensive shoes echoed across the marble floor until he stopped only a few feet from Naomi. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The crowd waited. Reporters held their breath. Richard lowered his head. "I spent my entire career believing I was saving my family's legacy." His voice had lost every trace of pride. "I never realized I was standing in the way of it." Naomi looked at him with quiet compassion instead of triumph. "Legacies are not measured by what we own," she said softly. "They are measured by what we leave standing for others." Richard closed his eyes. The sentence landed deeper than any public embarrassment could have. He slowly extended his hand toward Naomi. Not as a businessman. Not as the chairman. Simply as a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, how wrong he had been. The room watched in complete silence. Naomi hesitated only for a heartbeat before accepting the handshake. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, yet it transformed the atmosphere inside the library more completely than any legal document. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd. The people who had once looked at Naomi with dismissal now looked at her with unmistakable respect. Olivia captured the moment, knowing no headline could fully explain what had changed inside that room. Margaret smiled faintly, but her expression soon grew thoughtful again. She looked toward the tall windows where the fading evening light painted long golden lines across the shelves. "There is still one matter unfinished," she said. Every eye turned toward her once more. She reached into the leather case and slowly removed a small wooden box, darker than the surrounding papers and worn smooth by time. A single brass key rested inside beside an unopened envelope addressed, not to Richard, not to the city, but to Naomi Brooks. Naomi stared at her own name written in elegant ink. Her calm expression faltered for the first time that day as Margaret quietly whispered, "Your grandfather asked me to give you this only after the library found its way home." The library remained silent as Naomi Brooks looked down at the small wooden box resting in her hands. The last rays of evening sunlight filtered through the stained glass, painting warm ribbons of amber across the worn oak floor. Nobody reached for a microphone. One by one, the glowing screens of raised cell phones slowly lowered. Even the soft hum of the climate system seemed distant now, replaced only by the quiet rhythm of steady breathing. Naomi carefully lifted the brass key from the velvet lining. It was smooth from decades of careful hands, its edges softened by time rather than neglect. Beneath it rested a folded letter addressed in graceful handwriting. She unfolded it slowly. The paper carried the faint scent of cedar and old ink. Her grandfather's words were simple. "If you are reading this, then the library survived because someone chose courage over comfort. Do not protect these books because they are old. Protect them because every child who walks through these doors deserves a future larger than their circumstances." Naomi closed her eyes for only a moment. When she looked up again, there were tears in her eyes, but not one of them fell. Across the room, Richard Coleman stood motionless. The expensive watch on his wrist, the tailored suit, the polished shoes that had once echoed with confidence now seemed strangely insignificant against shelves that had quietly outlived generations of wealth and ambition. He stepped forward without looking at the cameras. "Miss Brooks." His voice was calm, stripped of pride. Naomi turned toward him. He drew a slow breath before speaking again. "I asked everyone here to believe in my vision." His eyes lowered briefly. "I never thought I should have believed in yours." The silence that followed carried no embarrassment, only honesty. Richard reached into his briefcase, removed the redevelopment contract, and laid it gently on the conference table. Without ceremony, he tore the signature page in half. No applause followed. None was needed. Several investors quietly gathered their folders and closed them forever. Emily Carter removed her board identification badge and placed it beside the abandoned contract. "I hope," she said softly, "we earn the right to come back." Naomi smiled with quiet warmth. "The library has always welcomed people willing to learn." Margaret Whitmore watched from the window, her reflection blending with the rows of books behind the glass. She nodded once, as though a promise carried across half a century had finally reached its destination. The following morning, the library doors opened at exactly 9 o'clock, just as they had every weekday for decades. No television crews remained. No reporters waited outside. Only the familiar scent of paper, polished wood, and fresh morning light drifting through the entrance. Naomi unlocked the front door with the old brass key and stepped aside as the first visitor entered. It was a little white girl carrying a backpack almost too large for her shoulders. She hesitated for a moment before looking up. "Excuse me," she asked quietly. "Can you help me find a book?" Naomi's smile deepened. "Of course." She knelt beside the child and gently placed a well-loved volume into her small hands. Behind them, Richard entered without announcement. He carried no briefcase, no assistants, no cameras. Only a donation envelope and a single library card application. He waited patiently until Naomi finished helping the little girl. Their eyes met across the quiet room. No words were necessary. The balance of power had disappeared, leaving only mutual respect. As the child walked toward a sunlit reading table, dust floated peacefully through the golden light, the old clock ticked another second, and the library breathed exactly as it always had, proving that the strongest people are not the ones who make the loudest entrance, but the ones who quietly leave the door open for everyone else.